mighty hand.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 14? Yeah, 14. Why do I never remember the number?
I don't know. It's a good show, though.
Oh, it's a good show.
It's a good show. Tell them who's on.
Now, as you know, we
just recorded it.
We don't usually have a lot of guests on our podcast. The last one we had was the Angry Gay Pope. We generally only ask people to be on the show if we really, really like them and are big fans.
Only if they're a real good guest.
Yeah. And so we were very, very excited to have our next guest on. I don't know if you guys know who he is, but his name is Dr. Robert M. Price. And he
also known as the Bible Geek.
Yes, he has a channel called the Bible Geek.
Yeah.
He is an atheist and a Jesus mythicist.
Yeah.
But he is also fascinated by the Bible and by the mythology of it. And
loves the Bible.
And he is has encyclopedic knowledge.
Yeah, this guy, his brain is like a rotary engine. Once it spools up, it just goes 1,000,000 miles an hour. All right, and it's just, it's awesome. It's awesome. I get tongue tied around it because I'm totally starstruck. And
yes, Tom is a huge fan.
I've been a huge fan.
And we actually
listened.
We listened to his like Genesis studies and stuff like that. We listened to him when we were going to sleep sometimes. Right. So, we've listened to him.
I listened to him during the day while you're working.
Yeah. So we've listened to him a bunch of times. But he's a super fascinating guy.
And you learn a lot about him.
And he's really funny and really entertaining. Now, we kind of want to do like a broad overview of some biblical mythology and some Jesus mythicism stuff. Obviously, there's a huge, huge topic and we only had about an hour. So, but I think we kind of covered a lot of ground in the interview.
Yeah. And this is just tip of the iceberg. If you're into this kind of stuff, you just go on his channel. You can ask questions. There's just tons and tons of this stuff. It's all awesome.
Just super fascinating. Yeah. And so what we're going to do, we recorded the interview separately just now. Mm. So what we're going to do is, because we didn't want to interrupt him for commercials and stuff, is I'm going to put in a commercial break right now with all the commercials. Mm. And then after that, he will just talk for an hour unimpeded. And then we'll come back and give a little close up with our stuff and stuff like that. Yeah. So I hope you guys enjoy this as much as we enjoy doing it. I didn't hardly talk during it all, because I just wanted him to go. And
we will have him back on. He's also good with H.P. Lovecraft stuff.
Yeah, he also writes fiction in a Lovecraftian vein and is also a Lovecraft scholar. He also has a channel. There's a channel or a blog called The Lovecraft Geek. Yeah. So we are definitely going to have him on at another point talking about H.P. Lovecraft.
He loves the mythology behind comic book characters, everything.
Yeah. So without further delay, I will play our commercial break, and then we will have an hour of interview with Robert M. Price.
Project Entertainment Network presents Buttercup of Doom with your host, Kelly Owen, just a girl who writes horror and thriller fiction, talks to bugs, jumps in puddles, and now hosts a weekly podcast full of opinions, advice, and a touch of gypsy wisdom. Whether it's current affairs or social media nightmares, join me as I rant and rave and offer up a big old bucket of common sense. Wednesdays on Buttercup of Doom.
If you're into cosplay, corsetry, steampunk, gothic, or rockabilly clothing, shoes, and accessories, then you must visit Subculture Corsets and Clothing, either online at www.subculturecorsets.com or drop by their store at the Avenues Mall in Jacksonville, Florida, located a half mile off I-95. Tell them you heard their ad on Project Entertainment Network and the 13 O'Clock podcast and receive a 10% discount off your entire purchase. Or when checking out on their website, use the discount code 13 o'clock and receive a 10% discount on your entire order. And if you're a full-figured girl, don't worry. Subculture carries sizes 4 through 4X, and they have men's clothing as well. That's subculturecorsets.com and use discount code 13 o'clock for a 10% discount. Go check out their website now, subculturecorsets.com, or when traveling through Jacksonville, Florida, stop in and check out their store at the Avenues Mall.
Bizarro!
It's Bizarro, the bizarre and weird fiction podcast, hosted by me, Mr. Frank. Bizarro is the showcase podcast of the Bizarro fiction genre. And those who write weird and Read Weird are going to love this podcast, where each week we talk to everyone who is anyone in the bizarre and weird fiction realm. So join us here every Monday, presented exclusively by Project Entertainment Network.
There are terrors, real and imaginary, and I write about them all. Paranormal nonfiction, horror fiction, the Rochdale House of Fire, the Mammoth Mountain Poltergeist, the Associated Monsters, Red Menace, the Five Poisons, Bellwether. Go to www.jennyashford.com or search Amazon for the Jenny Ashford author page.
Dr. Price, it's a real honor to have you on the show.
Oh, great pleasure to be on it.
Yeah, it's I'm almost speechless talking to you because I've been one of your students for years, and I'm really happy to be a patron. Dr. Price, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, I am now what they euphemize, not to say euthanize, as an independent scholar. My classroom teaching days are behind me, and I'm happily free of having to grade papers and the like. I now spend my time reading, researching, writing, and having a great time at it. My educational background, I always hate to say training because that sort of implies you're just like a dog getting trained to jump through hoops or something. But my educational background was I was at Montclair State College and graduated from there with a double major in history and religion and a minors in classics. Then I went on to Gordon Conwell Seminary, an interdenominational evangelical seminary, and studied New Testament there. It was just like a 2-year master's in New Testament. And after that, immediately I took a few more courses at Montclair, some of the good ones on anthropology, sociology, religion, stuff like that I hadn't been able to squeeze in the first time around. Then I went to while I was at Gordon Conwell, I also took some courses at Boston University School of Theology, Harvard Divinity School, and Princeton Seminary, all of which were just enormously fascinating. And so then I went to Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, and took a PhD degree in systematic theology. This was in I guess I finished it up in 81, and then I taught for some years, and then eventually went back to Drew and got a second PhD in New Testament. And again, all of it was just so great. I pester friends of mine, Bible geeks and others, that they ought to go back and get a doctoral degree in New Testament, even if they can't get a job, which they probably can't. But that's fun.
So you're known as the Bible Geek. How can people find you online?
I guess just do a search for the Bible Geek. I can't keep addresses and stuff like that in my head. But I'm sure Bible Geek figures prominently.
Yeah, and you have a YouTube channel, and I think that's it, right? Just a YouTube and a Patreon.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
And my own website is robertmprice.mindvendor.com, and that's got a big archive of short stories, sermons, columns, articles, and all kinds of stuff. And you can subscribe for free there to my monthly column and newsletter, Zarathustra Speaks. And I guess there's a link to the Patreon page, too.
And you've written a lot of books, too.
A bunch. I've edited a whole lot of fiction anthologies in the vein of H.P. Lovecraft. And I've had one collection of my stories in the Lovecraft field published, a book called Blasphemies and Revelations. But then in the area of religion, I've had a lot of stuff published, books on the historical Jesus, like Deconstructing Jesus, the incredible shrinking Son of Man, the Christ myth theory and its problems, and so on. And I did a real long one on Paul called The Amazing Colossal Apostle.
Yeah.
I did my own New Testament translation called the Pre-Nicene New Testament, and there's all kinds of other ones on the shelf or in the works.
Now, what makes you so special is that you're a mythicist and an atheist, and you love the Bible. You're not anti-Bible or anti-religion at all. Can you explain this to us? How this works?
I once did an article called "Is the Bible Mein Kampf?" because a lot of atheists, many of whom are reacting against conservative religious paths, seem to think it's just filled with evil and reprehensible barbarism and all that. And it's like they're still looking at it through the same old prism in a sense. They just don't like it anymore. But it's, for me, like the thing that got me out of believing in biblical authority and literalism and all that was that if you figured, okay, now this is the word of God, it can't have any mistakes, it can't have the writers contradicting each other. If you approached it with those blinders on, it just often made no sense.
Right.
And because it sure looks like this one contradicts this one. If this guide to interpreting says, no, you're hallucinating, Christ, it really doesn't, that can't be right. It's like a Christian Scientist. Well, I seem to be sick, but I guess I'm not. I view inerrancy as the Christian Science approach to the Bible. Well, so eventually a lot of us come to this point. You figure, I got to decide between believing in the authority of the Bible and understanding the Bible. And it's got its hook in me. I'm so curious about it that even if I don't believe anymore, I really am fascinated by this work. And so you move into kind of like the mentality of a classicist who doesn't for a split second think that Zeus and Athena and Achilles ever existed. Boy, is it interesting. Yeah. Now, suppose you then found out that there was some sect out there that said, oh, no, the Iliad and the Odyssey are literally true. You've got to believe in Zeus and so forth, and equal time for Zeus in classrooms. Would think, wait a minute, I've got to share what I know about the Iliad and the Odyssey, not because I hate it and want to combat it, but because I love it and don't want to see it abused.
Right.
And so that's kind of the way I view the Bible. It's just so fascinating, and all the more if you don't feel obliged to believe all of it.
What kind of book is the Bible in its entirety? I know it's a huge subject, but what are they trying to tell us with this book?
Well, it's a kind of a cultural library of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, and there are all kinds of writings in it. The Old Testament has a number of sets of song lyrics, the Psalms, which were the hymn book of the Jerusalem temple, and the Song of Solomon, which probably was the liturgy of the worship of Tammuz and Ishtar before they changed the names. There are proverbs in it, like collections of wise sayings that are still really great stuff. Nobody should have any trouble with those. There are boring parts of it for the general reader because they weren't written for general consumption. In fact, nothing was back then because there was no real way to make anything popular. You couldn't go to a bookstore, hey, give me a copy of Leviticus. Yeah. And even if you did it, you wouldn't understand it because it wasn't written for you. It's like a technical manual for Levitical priests. Why the heck are there all these genealogies? Well, it was credentials for priests and kings. It wasn't supposed to be interesting even, much less entertaining. Then the stories, which we all like best, a lot of those were anecdotes written to legitimate social arrangements like the subordination of women to men. Certainly that's one of the big things in the Eden story. Some of them were written just or told to explain puzzling things when no scientific explanation was available, like why do snakes crawl? Yeah. And do they hate it or like it? Oh, they must hate it, so God must have punished them. Yeah. And why do we wear clothes? I mean, other animals don't. What the heck? And so here's the Eden story again. Why is this odd rock formation here? It kind of looks like a figure of a woman standing out here in the middle of, well, that's the prototype for the Morton Salt label, Lot's wife. And there are other similar myths and legends in other countries that show the same sort of thing. What is the rainbow? Well, obviously, these people knew nothing about light refraction. How could they? So one thing I always like to point out to students, we are tempted to think the ancients were stupid, and of course they were not. They just didn't have access to technology yet, and so these myths are themselves the product of a creative intelligence. So they said, well, it looks kind of like a war bow, and Jehovah is a storm god. He must have shot his lightning bolts from this bow, and he tried to flood us all out, but then thought better of it and said, okay, I'm hanging up the bow, like I'm hanging up the gloves. That's pretty good. It's factually incorrect. Why did the Genesis 1 writer think that the earth was covered by a solid dome and floating on a universal ocean? Was that stupid? No, it's not even mythology. It's like the pre-Socratic natural philosophers. And that's what they said is what it actually looks like until you get telescopes and so on. So there's all kinds of inventive, why were certain things given place names that didn't make any sense anymore, even way back then. And so they kind of try to break down the long word like Be'er Lahairoi. What the heck does that mean? Well of something. And so they broke it down. The well of one who sees and lives. And so we get the story of Hagar, who saves her life by drinking water out of this well because an angel shows it to her. And she says, have I seen the angel of the Lord and lived to tell it? Aha, the well of one who sees and lives. Whereas it actually meant the well of the antelope's jawbone. It was just describing the lay of the land so you could find the thing. And it's just filled with stuff like that. And it's not, there's some imposture and priestcraft, as they used to call it. Sometimes you're trying to get away with something, but a lot of it's just a collection of great old sagas and legends and so on. Then the New Testament is more of the same with the Gospels. In fact, I kind of think that virtually all the stories in the Gospels are rewrites, some closer, some freer, of Old Testament stories. And then there are treatises like the Pauline epistles explaining different versions of Christian doctrine. And they all kind of share a similar religious and cultural milieu, but there certainly is no unanimity of belief or doctrine. And it's certainly not really a source for history. So you can be disappointed at that, but that just means you were looking for the wrong thing. It's a grab bag and a fascinating one.
Well, let's go back to Genesis. What kind of world are they talking about? What kind of God is this they're talking about? I noticed that their terms for addressing God are very different. You'll hear El, you'll hear Yahweh, you'll also hear the word Elohim. Is this one God they're talking about, or have they harmonized several gods?
It appears that the latter is the case. And on the one hand, there's a good amount of evidence that they shared these gods with the surrounding tribes and nations. We already knew that for a long time with El, E-L, and which is the root of the Muslim name, Allah. It means the God. And apparently the root for that is the strong one. But a lot of people, it was a name, but it was generic. You look at the Canaanite documents that came to light over a century ago, and they've got some of the same names for the same gods. So they're worshiping the same deity, just slightly different stories. Yahweh or Jehovah, we had thought for a long time was a distinctive name for the God of Israel, but it turns out even that is not true because Baal was sometimes called Yahweh, and apparently there were various other peoples in the Middle East that worshipped a God named Yahweh or Jehovah, and there was apparently for a long time a whole pantheon of Israelite deities, and the notion was that El also called El Elyon, God Most High. He was the king of the gods, and he had 70 sons, the famous sons of God that pop up in the Old Testament. And he divided, in Deuteronomy 32 says that he divided up mankind into enough nations so that each of the sons of God would be able to be worshiped by his own nation. And that's referred to various other times in the Old Testament. And that Yahweh was one of the sons of El Elyon, and he was in charge of Israel. So later on, they began to streamline the whole thing, so that I guess the ruling theologians decided that El Elyon and Yahweh were the same God, just different names. And these other gods were angels, and so they tinkered with that as the centuries went on. We only find a monotheism in the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah, which, even if the traditional dates are right, are pretty late. But you can tell reading the various stories that Israelites for a long time weren't yet monotheists, but were monolaters, which means worshipers of one God, not denying that there are other gods. Like in Exodus 20, when the preamble to the Ten Commandments, I am Yahweh, your God, who delivered you out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods alongside me. Well, that's not a statement of monotheism. It's saying, I am the one to whom you owe this great debt, and so you will worship me, not others. And that implies there are others. It's just that they're not your God. You've got no business with them.
Yeah.
Even though that's prescriptive, not descriptive. Right, and a lot of the Old Testament stuff, the writers are trying to get people to embrace monotheism, a new idea, so you can trace the evolution of even God in the Bible.
So you have God, his sons, and then it says that his sons mate with mortal women, and then making Nephilim. Well, that's the same as the Greek pantheon. You have Zeus, his sons, and them having sex with mortal women, producing demigods. It's like the Greek system. It's like a Greek pantheon.
Yeah, and there may even be some overlap. There's a reason to think that Samson is just the Hebrew version of Hercules.
Okay.
I mean, if he's not, he certainly fits the same slot. Both were originally sun gods who were then cut down to size as myth became legend and gods became demigods. They were on the earth among human beings, but they were half God. This is a process that happens in a lot of religions. So, and it says that the Nephilim were the mighty men of renown. Well, that's the epic heroes like Gilgamesh, who's mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They believed in him, and Samson and Nimrod, who it was the same as the Greek Orion, the Titan. And so, yeah, it was exactly the same sort of stuff. And my guess is, like in the Samson story and several others, where the mother-to-be is not yet pregnant, because they say she's barren, but more than likely the husband was sterile. And so she is impregnated by the angel of Yahweh or whatever. I'm making an educated guess that in those stories, God in human form did actually impregnate the women exactly as in Greek mythology, but that got kind of cleaned up too. So it is, I think, just the same.
Now, in Exodus, Moses speaks to the burning bush. Who does this burning bush claim to be? Is it? Well,
there were ways of getting around that if you didn't want God to be down and dirty on earth with humans. He says that I am that I am. Tell them that I am has sent me. He says to Moses, tell them that Yahweh has sent me. It's a pun because they're figuring that Yahweh comes from Hayah, to be in Hebrew. But at any rate, he's certainly being addressed by the voice of God. Well, later rabbis said, well, it's a little hard to imagine the transcendent Lord of the universe showing up in a fireworks display on a mountainside in Nowheresville. And so they said, well, he was speaking through that, but it was an angel of Yahweh. Angel just means messenger. And so there was a way of sort of wriggling out of it. And that sounds kind of fishy, but it shows that they were going for a more transcendent, nearly philosophical view of God, and had to try to make sense of the old stories, which is just what the Greeks did too. The Stoics, they invented allegory to take crude and morally embarrassing stories and to say, well, it doesn't really mean that. It means something moral or philosophical. And apparently Jews got it from the Greeks.
Okay. So the when Moses is on the top of the mountain, it sounds a lot like he's talking to a volcano, if you ask me. There's fire up there. Fire on the top of the mountain. Is that a Baal symbol, or is that more symbolic of Baal, or is it Yahweh? Or was this story originally about another god? Was it a story that was adapted from another religion?
It's hard to say. It does presuppose the storm god image, and the fire is very likely supposed to be lightning flashes. Sometimes it denotes that, and there's the heavy cloud and the thundering and the trumpets and so forth. He is pictured often in the Bible as a storm god, again, like Zeus, Thor, Indra, etc., and also a war god, because they were often the same thing, because the crashing in the heavens was the clash of divine armies and so on. And so he's pictured as a storm god atop the mountain, and Baal was a storm god. Both are described in their different literatures as riding cloud chariots. The cherubim are apparently personified clouds. So that they're either just exact counterparts or two names for the same deity. And I lean toward the latter. In the prophet Hosea, God says, the day is coming when you will no longer call me my Baal, but my husband. Baal means master, but it was like a name. His full title was Elyon Baal, which seems to be the same thing as El Elyon, Baal the Most High. And one Canaanite text says that Baal's name is Yah, a short version of Yahweh. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think they simply were the same God, worshipped a bit differently by cousin adjacent groups.
I got you. So it's like two different cults in the same religion, worshiping the same God in different ways. Which that might explain why there's a part in the Bible where, in the Old Testament, where you have a priest of the cult of Yahweh and then a priest of the cult of Baal, both in a competition to call down fire out of the sky.
That's right. Yeah, Elijah and the prophets of Baal.
Okay.
And it even says that there are 450 prophets of Baal and another 400 of Asherah, who was widely worshipped in Israel too. There were images of her all over the place that the Bible mentions and condemns. Well, that was the same in the Canaanite pantheon. They're the god and goddess. And in fact, we have bas-reliefs from, I believe, either in Israel or adjacent to it, where it shows two seated figures, and it says Yahweh and his Asherah. So there was a male and a female God and the divine consort for a long, long time.
So like Zeus and Hera.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Wow, interesting. Okay, what about Elijah and Elisha? Are they the same person?
You very seldom hear that guess, but you have to wonder, given that the names are so similar. However, I think that originally they represented one of the many astrological or astronomical, same thing back then, myths about the sun and the moon striving to replace one another. They would often take celestial phenomena that happen all the time and tell a story about them where it's a one-time event. And so Elijah seems to be a sun god. It says that he's a hairy man in 2 Kings 1. You saw this guy, this prophet, what did he look like? Oh, he was a hairy man, O king. Oh, my God, it's Elijah. And that's for the sun's rays, like Hercules killing the Nemean lion with the mane, and Samson having the 7 great locks of hair. He's the sun god. His name even means the sun. And like Samson, Elijah does stuff with fire. He calls down fire from heaven to kill the Samaritan soldiers and so on. And when he leaves the earth, he boards a fiery chariot and ascends to the zenith of the heavens. Come on, obviously, he's a sun god. Well, that's the only description we ever hear of him, that he's a hairy man, whether it means his clothes or his hair on his head, who knows. But the only thing we ever hear about Elisha is that he's bald in the famous story. Go up, oh bald head, and he sicks the bears on him. Well, why tell us that he's bald? Well, because he's the moon. And so the sun leaves and the moon replaces it. It's the same thing with Jacob, who is a smooth man, and Esau, who is a hairy man. And there are many examples of this. And so that's probably the origin of the myth, and that would make me say, they're probably understood as 2 different characters.
So really, nothing in the Old Testament is actually historical. It's all mythological.
I would say so. There are, in the latter parts of it, references to actual kings, Omri and Jehu and all that. And it's possible that some of these, the least interesting parts of the Old Testament are historical, but these things are purely naturalistic. There's nothing about God isn't showing up at the door like, Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, in the Abraham story, Jehovah shows up at the door, and you don't have that. It's like they're more in touch with the real world the later you go. But I think that's the big mark of Old Testament minimalism, that there's the barest minimum of historical information very late, that there may well never have been a David, a Solomon, much less a Moses. So on.
Is there any way to date the Old Testament?
There are educated guesses, but none of them are certain. And the first real scientific critics, Groff and Wellhausen, Kuhnen, and these guys in the 19th century, they saw that Genesis through Deuteronomy had to be the product of a bunch of different earlier source documents harmonized, like people do with the Gospels today. You can find several editions of people trying to weave them together and get all the stories in a plausible order. Well, that's what they did. And so they dated each one of them and said, well, let's see, the J source, the document that refers to God as Jehovah or Yahweh, that must be around the time of Solomon or Rehoboam, somewhere in 900 BCE. And the E document, where they call God Elohim, that kind of overlaps J, and the stories where they overlap, E seems to have a more advanced, doctored up, polished up version. So that must be a little bit later. And they figured maybe around 800. And then the priestly, they figured maybe the book of Deuteronomy must come from around the reign of King Josiah. So that put that around 730. And the priestly code must have been written during the exile by the priest. So that would make it somewhere around 500. And that was reasonable, and they had good evidence for it, but of course it's hypothetical. And now, over a century later, everything has changed. It still seems like they divided the text correctly, that you can spot these different sources and their signature marks, but there's now reason to believe that the Exodus story may have been based on an Egyptian book by the priest Manetho, who had a version of the Israelites being expelled from Egypt. And Genesis may be based on the work of a Babylonian priest named Berosus, who wrote in Greek. And it's like there's so much overlap, these stories and no others, that if this is true, then the Genesis and Exodus, at least, would seem to be something like 3rd century BCE, and much, much later than we thought, and not that far removed from the New Testament. I think that they're even later than that. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was done in the Ptolemaic Empire, Hellenistic Egypt, and that we figured, and they figured that was in the 3rd century BCE. Well, it now looks like possibly the Hebrew and the Greek Old Testament were written by the same people at the same time, and that puts it really late. And if I'm not mistaken, it's even later than that. It might be something like the 2nd century BC. So it's not as old as we thought by a long shot, though relative to us, it's pretty darn old.
So they're basically reboots.
Yeah, I mean, we figured that anyway because
Yeah.
of the flood stories being
Right.
so similar. And you can see how things in Genesis look so much like stuff from the Adapa myth and the Gilgamesh epic. A big chunk of the Proverbs seems to be based on the wisdom of Amun and Mophis in Egypt and things like that. It kind of looks like a lot of it was sort of secondhand adaptation anyhow. Or even the Book of the Covenant, the oldest part of the law code in Genesis, looks like it was based on the Code of Hammurabi. And so actually Thomas Aquinas dealt with this way back in the Middle Ages, because even if you took it all literally, it's obvious that some of the Bible is explicitly based on earlier documents. It says we got this from the books of the kings of Judah and all that. And he says, that's the difference between revelation and inspiration. These originals weren't revealed by God. They're not revelation, but they're inspiration because the Holy Spirit guided the redaction and editing. He was already coping with that sort of thing. And some Roman Catholic theologians have a very similar sophisticated approach to it today, like Raymond Brown and a lot of these guys. They're genuine critical scholars. They don't force it into a straitjacket of fundamentalism as their predecessors did long ago.
So the people who are handing these stories down to us, they're not attempting to deceive us. They believe these stories to be true. Yes?
Oh, yeah. I think there are a few where there are hints that they were written to keep people in line. Like the Eden story and the Tower of Babel story, both say God is threatened by the potential of the creatures he made, and he doesn't want them to know too much. Well, that sounds to me like the priests that want to keep the people ignorant, like Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. There are, like in the book of Acts, where Peter kills Ananias and Sapphira because they welched on their church pledge. That has to be just a kind of propaganda scare story. There's a couple of things in the Gospels, like the women at the tomb. The angel says, Jesus is risen, go tell Peter, he'll meet him in Galilee, and they leave and say nothing to anyone. How the heck did Mark know about it?
Yeah.
Well, he's trying to say, I know, fellow Christians, you never heard about this empty tomb stuff until now. Why is that? Well, it's not because I made it up. No, it's because the women didn't say anything. So there are a handful, but on the whole, I don't think you're really dealing with that. It was just imaginative storytelling, and people figured, well, this must be it. This must be how it happened.
I think this is a good time to start talking about the New Testament then. What is the New Testament? Where did this come from?
Well, most folks who study this think the epistles of Paul were written in the 50s CE or AD, whatever you prefer, and that the Gospels followed a few decades later. But, and this is true of even some mythicists like Richard Carrier and Earl Doherty and so on, but I think they're too conservative, believe it or not. I tend to go with the Dutch radical school of the 19th century. Bruno Bauer, W.C. van Manen, and others said, No, it kind of looks like all of these letters attributed to Paul, all 13 of them are pseudepigraphical, that is, written pseudonymously. That, yeah, there was a Paul, but he was a famous name, and they just attributed their own stuff to him. Critical scholars like Bart Ehrman today say half of them are not actually by Paul. They can see, well, yeah, this is an anachronism, this is a different literary style, and they say half of them, okay, he didn't write these 6, but these 7 he did. Well, Bauer and Van Manen and others said, hold on a second. If you apply those criteria consistently, you got to give up all of them. They all appear to be too late in the game to actually, if we know anything about this Paul, this stuff couldn't have been written that early. The author's talking about keep the traditions that I delivered to you. Paul's teaching, given a couple of months before to the Thessalonians, is a tradition, and various other things. And so, when were the Gospels and the Epistles written? I tend to lump them all around the very late 1st to the mid-2nd century. And who wrote them, we don't know. They're either pseudonymous or anonymous, like the Gospels. No names in the text. They've just been tacked on with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, probably in the 2nd century. And of course, the Gospels are narratives of Jesus. And as I already said, I think almost all of the narrative material in them comes from the Old Testament. So they're very, very close in some cases. Others have big clues. The book of Acts also is based partly on the Old Testament, partly on Euripides, the Bacchae. That was very influential in the book of Acts, I think. And the epistles, loads of them by different people, and again, pseudonymous or anonymous, like the 3 epistles of John. There's no name on those at all. And so they're in the book of Revelation, of course, a big favorite. I always enjoy that one. This thing that purports to be a series of visions of the heavens and the future, that was a common genre. We're swimming in apocalypses written by Jews and Christians, and they don't really record anybody's visions. That was just a literary gimmick. And again, not deceptive. That was just the genre. It was a way of getting your speculations and beliefs across.
Now, many modern Christians see the Gospels and the Gospel stories as the source of Christianity. Is that true?
No, I think the Catholics are right on this one, that it was the church that produced the Bible, not the other way around.
Right.
And there were many other books that many Christians read, some of them considered to be parts of the New Testament, even by church fathers for a while. And then they kind of dropped out of consideration. But the earliest Jesus believers predate the Gospels, and this comes up in the whole mythicism thing, the belief that Jesus didn't actually exist as a historical figure, partly because in the Pauline epistles, there's no real discussion of a Jesus who was a wandering teacher, who ever did any miracles, nothing about him healing and exorcising. There's nothing, none of the stuff you find in the Gospels, with 1 or 2 exceptions that kind of look like they've been added later. And why is that? I mean, if Paul, for instance, if this is really him writing, and such material was available, I mean, teachings of Jesus, surely he addresses a lot of the subjects that come up in the Gospels. Why doesn't he quote Jesus? And so you begin to think, well, there were people that believed in some kind of Jesus before there was any gospel material.
Wow, that's amazing. So it seems to be that the Pauline epistles predate the Gospels.
They might, but in my view, you can't really tell, and it almost doesn't matter, because the point would, in any case, would be that the group, either the person or the group of people that wrote this, knew nothing about gospel type material, sayings, narratives, and maybe they didn't know about it because the stuff didn't exist yet. We don't know, though, but if the former, that just means they seem to have stemmed from a time, even if they're written later, the epistles seem to come from a group that maintained an earlier form of Christianity, one without all this ado about a historical Jesus.
Now, when you look at the four Gospels, do all the Gospels agree on the nature of Jesus? In other words, was Jesus born the Messiah or the Son of God, or did he become the Messiah later?
Well, it appears from the earliest of the Gospels, Mark, that Jesus becomes the Son of God at his baptism or at his resurrection. In fact, it's kind of a compromised document, as William Vrede pointed out in the 19th century, that he's juggling two different current Christian views, one that Jesus was the Messiah as of his resurrection, and the other that he had been made the Son of God at his baptism, and he tries to figure out how both could be true. But in either case, there's no pre-existent heavenly Jesus in that view. Matthew and Luke seem to believe Jesus is a kind of a demigod, that there's no Jesus before the birth in Bethlehem, and he's born the Son of God then. And then John's gospel knows nothing of a virgin birth, interestingly. It has people refer to Jesus as the son of Joseph with no embarrassment, no correction or anything. It has Jesus as the earthly incarnation of the divine Logos, an aspect of God that existed with God before the world was created. And so they're very different views. It's easy to see how they evolve progressively, though, because if you say like in Mark, at the baptism, it says the Holy Spirit descended into him. And that's like the Gnostics and others that said Jesus was basically the channeler for a heavenly being, an angel, etc. Well, then later on, it's not that much of a step between saying that and saying that the divine Logos was in him, and maybe that began earlier. Nobody ever thought Jesus lived before the creation in a human body somewhere. So it's not that big a step, but in fact, they don't seem to have exactly the same view of Jesus.
Is there any evidence for a historical Jesus? Anything secular?
No, the hoopla that never seems to die about Josephus, the historian who wrote at the end of the first century, whether he mentions Jesus or not, I think that's been blown out of the water. The mini paragraph in which he discusses Jesus in our manuscripts, which are much, much later than the date of writing, it has been demonstrated in three different ways. I won't bore you into a coma with, but it couldn't have been written by the guy that wrote the rest of this huge book. I mean, you can tell what his writing is like, etc. But even if he did write it, he's writing like 60 years after Jesus would have died. And so was he a witness of Jesus? Of course not. Nobody denies that Christians believed there had been a Jesus by the end of the first century. And so what would he know but that? And the same thing with Tacitus, writing about 30 years after Josephus. He knows that supposedly a guy named Christus or Crestus, manuscripts differ, was crucified under Pontius Pilate. But how would he know this? Well, almost certainly from Christian preaching. So that's evidence for Christianity, not for Jesus, and that really is it. There really isn't any. Now, the classic response that Bart and Ehrman and others say is that, well, you see, if you could say that if Jesus was the miracle-working Superman of the Gospels, they could hardly have avoided mentioning it in secular sources. It would have been big news. But, of course, critical scholars say, no, that stuff is legend. We're not fundamentalists. But was there a Jesus around whom these legends gathered? Oh, yeah, there must have been. And that's where I differ. If you cut Jesus down to size in that way, you're basically saying, oh, yeah, there was a historical Superman, all right, but he was just Clark Kent. Well, why would anybody have taken notice of this guy?
Right.
Why would Christians have taken note of him? and one more wandering rabbi. I mean, there were loads of those. So why? And so I don't think there really is evidence. That doesn't mean there wasn't one, but I just think you'd have to have some better evidence. And all of it wouldn't even take much. Suppose we've got old papyrus letters from this very period that were preserved in Egypt in the dry climate. Nothing big, little notes, almost like today's post-it notes. Businessmen would send letters back to their wives, asking them, how you doing? Here's what I'm up to. Suppose we had one of those. Where some merchant said to his wife, I was in Jerusalem and chanced to hear the famous Jesus the Nazarene, a teacher of wisdom. Suppose that's it. Like that would be enough to throw out the whole mythicist hypothesis, but there isn't. Now, maybe they'll discover one and that'll be it for mythicism. I'm not married to the idea, but failing that, we just don't have anything that would really count as evidence.
You know what time it is, Dr. Price?
Nope.
I'll tell you what time it is. It's time for Revelation.
Hallelujah.
The paperback apocalypse.
Ah, yes.
What is up with that book? That's like an acid trip. An acid trip with dead bodies rising up and dragons and Godzillas. What is the meaning behind...
Well, all the nifty monsters, and boy, do I wish Toho Studios would do a scene-by-scene adaptation, because they almost did. There's this really neat movie they did called Yamato Takeru, based on Shinto mythology, that is a lot like it. I really wish they would. Anyhow, the monsters come from way back. Mythology shared by the Canaanites, the Babylonians, just about everybody in the ancient world. How did Yahweh become the king of gods? Well, there's this great myth that in the same way Marduk did, the same way Baal did, the same way Indra did, etc., the gods were shaken in their boots because of the threat of the chaos dragons, and they weren't up to the challenge. And so one young, virile warrior god, Baal, Yahweh, etc., steps forward and said, I can take care of this if you will make me the new king of the gods, because he will have shown he deserves it. And I said, sure, gladly. And so he goes into battle with the dragon, who is described in the Canaanite sources as a 7-headed dragon. And he's called Lotan, or in Hebrew, Leviathan, because that's the name of a big river in Lebanon, the Litani River. It was in the news a few years ago when a fight was going on there. And they figured it was a dragon because it was the twisting serpent like a river, and it had a lot of tributaries, hence the many heads. The Hydra that Hercules fights. Hydra means water. Well, that must have come from the same sort of personification. Okay, so he does defeat him, though he is eaten and killed in the process and raised from the dead, and then defeats the dragon, becomes king of the gods, and so on. Very, very old mytheme. Well, in the apocalyptic writings, they believe that when this age ended, it would basically repeat the events of the primordial time. The time of the creation would be repeated at the end, presaging the creation of a new world. And so the dragon that rises up out of the sea is Leviathan. And when Michael the archangel defeats him, he's taken the place of the young warrior god Yahweh. And so the whole thing, the fall of the dragon Satan from heaven, again, the same thing. So a lot of this comes from that. A lot of the rest of it, including the horns, the trumpets, the comets, the way the locusts from the bottomless pit are described, this is all ancient astrology. That virtually all of it, the 24 elders, they're the decans, Draco, the dragon pursuing the woman about to give birth, that's Draco following Virgo in the wheel of the stars at night. Virtually everything is ancient astrology or astronomy.
Because it's happening in the heavens.
Yeah.
It's happening in the heavens, so therefore that's gods. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And John says he's taken up to heaven to see this.
Right.
And was he lying, or did he actually have a hallucinogenic trip? Well, neither one. This was the way the ancient scribes, the wise men, wrote down their speculations. Because in other ones, like in First Enoch goes into the heavens and they show him the layout of the place. Here is where the snowflakes are stored. Here's where the raindrops are stored. Here's where the lightnings are stored, and they come down out of here. Over here is where the fallen angels are imprisoned, and so on and so on. How'd they know that? Well, they just speculated. They figured, I bet that's the way it's set up. And so how are they going to publicize it? Oh, Enoch, the ancient scribe, actually saw this.
Wow.
And it was just the way they published the stuff. And that's why all the preoccupation with the stars.
What about the beast and the Antichrist and all that? What are they talking about?
Well, almost certainly the beast is supposed to be the Roman emperor. And it's a little complicated, but we know the slightly complicated myth it's based on. The Romans thought of Nero as such a great villain. Their imagination couldn't let him go. It's just like for decades, you would hear that, Hitler's still alive. He's down in South America, which wasn't impossible, but,
right.
Why did anybody think so? It's just you don't want to see the last of Darth Vader. I'm looking forward to seeing Rogue One because my hero Darth Vader is going to be same thing. And Dr. Doom, Lex Luthor, you think they're dead, but no, they're going to come back. They felt the same way about Nero, that he had been killed by the Praetorian Guard, and they said, I bet we haven't seen the last of him. I bet he either had a double kill. They used to say that about Saddam Hussein also. And the real thing escaped across the Euphrates and took refuge in the Parthian Empire. Or he was killed, but was raised from the dead and went to the Parthians, and they were the great enemy that Rome feared, this powerful empire of Persia, Afghanistan, etc. And they were afraid they would break through. And so they said, well, they're going to. And Nero is going to lead the troops and destroy Rome in revenge. And so this seems to appear in the book of Revelation because 666, though it could mean a lot of things, I think almost has to be the numerical conversion of the title Neron Caesar, Nero Caesar in Greek, because they in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin they use the same figures for numbers and letters, like Roman numerals, letters, same thing in all these languages, and they would add up the number values and use that as a kind of a code for their names. So they figured, the writer says, you know who I mean, because it's all written by and for scribes who love to like the parables of Jesus. Let him who has ears to hear, let him hear. It's, do you get me? I'm not going to just throw my pearls before swine. You got to work for it. And so he says it's the number of a man. His number is 666. So Nero. But the book doesn't seem to be written that early. It seems to be written later, at the end of the first century. And what they probably mean is that the reigning emperor Domitian is the resurrected Nero, because there's this weird stuff about how there's 7 heads and the beast is is one of the 7 and yet a 10th, and so on and so on. What is that supposed to mean? And he has a mortal wound that was healed. Well, it sounds like they're saying that the latest emperor really is the return of one of the previous ones who was dead and rose and is going to lead the Parthians across the Euphrates to destroy a harlot that sits on the 7 hills. It's got to be Rome. And even the way the centaur troops of Parthia are described with hair like the hair of women. They have breastplates of bronze armor and so on. They're describing the Parthian cavalry. And so it's not that difficult to penetrate if you know the way these things were always written and what the current images were.
Wow.
So
now, whenever Christians talk about demons, it always seems to be not quite the same thing. Are they fallen angels? Are they the ghosts of the evil dead? There seems to be demonic possession involved. Sometimes, like I said, is the Spirit of God inside of Jesus possessing him in a holy way? What are they talking about? Is this like some kind of a demon possession cult Christianity?
Well, yeah, they didn't cultivate it like in the voodoo religion, where it's the spirits of gods that they're summoning, and they have like divine ecstasy, though you could say Pentecost is a kind of an example. But demon possession was usually an explanation for illness that was intractable. Medicine didn't help. And so they figure, well, what the heck is going on? It must be the devil is victimizing him with his flunkies, the demons, holding people hostage, basically. So if we can gain power over the prince of demons, we can twist his arm and force him to let him go, which is where the stuff comes about. Comes from. He's casting out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of the demons. Well, exorcists did that, they thought. Well, what were these things? In the life of Apollonius of Tyana, a contemporary miracle worker, a Neo-Pythagorean preacher, there it's pretty clear that when he casts out demons, it is the ghosts of the wicked dead.
Okay.
And they tend to be vampires also. Vampires were a type of ghost in the ancient world. But in Jewish literature, the New Testament period, we're told that the demons were fallen angels or the ghosts of the Nephilim once they died.
Okay.
They're both versions, and they're very similar stories. And in the book of Jubilees, the fallen angel Mastema, who's I suppose the same as Satan, he is stationed as the tempter, because in the Old Testament he actually wasn't a bad guy most of the time. He put people on trial. He set up sting operations to see if they were really loyal to God or not, like Job, for instance. Well, so he's got his job to do there, but God is going to sentence all of his cohorts who joined him in rebellion to the netherworld, to be chained in the darkness. An idea just comes right out of Greek mythology. The Titans and the giants were chained up down there. And Mastema says, well, if I'm to do my job, I'm going to need some staff. And he says, give me 1/10 of the fallen angels to do my work. He said, okay, so you've got most of them imprisoned underground, but you've got a lot of them inhabiting the lower heavens, right? They had different concentric domed heavens, and they're around causing mischief. Well, so they're causing illness, especially epilepsy. In fact, the word epilepsy means literally being seized upon. Epi and lex is you're being seized upon by some alien agent. And this was a diagnostic category because they didn't know. I mean, how could they know what was actually happening? Right. And so they said it must be an invasive possession. And so it's like, again, imaginative pre-scientific reasoning.
Wow.
And now the more interesting part of it was the doctrine of the principalities and powers, which took the sons of God thing in a different direction and retained the notion that they ruled the nations. The idea of demon possession is different, but it's just branching off the same myth, so that Yahweh or El Elyon assigned Rimmon Syria. Okay, you rule Syria, and this one to that, and Baal rules this, and Thoth rules that. Well, they kept that even though they vilified the sons of God. Oh, they shouldn't have made it with those mortal women. They went wrong. They fell, and so forth. But this came in handy as an explanation too, because they said, why is government so irredeemably corrupt? I mean, it's terrible today, but it was the rule in the ancient world. naturally you paid off people and nothing got done, and there was no control over people, and yet it was better than chaos. Hobbes's war of all against all. We don't want that. It's like if the mob rules Chicago, that's bad, but it would be worse if not even they were there. And so they had this actually sophisticated view of the principalities and powers in heavenly places. And it's a perfect way of describing what actually happens in the world. People start multinational corporations or whatever. They grow beyond human control. They're their own entities in a strange way. And so it's a perfect myth for that. And in fact, I don't think you can really understand what's going on in cases like that without this myth, not believing it, but it articulates it so well. Yeah. And so that kept the idea that they were the rulers of the earth. And this ties into the book of Revelation and all of that apocalyptic stuff, because they said, look, we don't know why God allowed them to take over, but it's going to be moot soon because he's going to take over. Like in the book of Revelation, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Yeah. And that's how us Trump voters feel after Obama and Clinton were cast down from heaven. It's just as an analogy, not really editorializing, but it's the idea, thank God that's over, or it soon will be. Maybe God will tell us how he allowed things to go that way when we get to heaven, but I don't really care as long as it's over. And so that was the great hope of Apocalyptic.
Wow. Awesome. What are you working on now? You working on a book?
Yeah, a book called Bart Ehrman Interpreted, a little play on one of his titles, Jesus Interrupted. He's a friend of mine, and I enjoy his books, but I find a lot of people like both his stuff and mine, and wonder why I don't agree more with him or he with me. And so the idea of this book is to take what I think are his major views and show why I differ. So it's not really polemical, but it's saying, here's what I think he's saying. Here's why I don't buy that, but do buy this. And so it's like an ironic sketch of the differences between us. And I'm having a lot of fun reading for it and writing it. I've got great titles like the title on his book, Jesus Before the Gospels, I think it is, about oral tradition. My chapter on that is called Blessed Are the Cheesemakers. His chapter on textual criticism, like what did the Bible actually originally say? Can we weed out the copyist errors? My chapter on that is called When I Get That Feeling, I Want Textual Healing.
That's awesome.
That's half of the fun.
Yeah. I'm encouraging all our viewers to go to the Bible Geek, look up Dr. Robert M. Price, Bible Geek on YouTube, and subscribe to him. There's a lot of really good stuff there on his channel. Interviews. He answers questions. And anything you'd like to plug, Doctor?
Oh, before too awfully long, I have a massive 2-volume set of books coming out called Holy Fable, the Old Testament undistorted by faith, and then the New Testament undistorted by faith. And it deals with almost every book of the Bible, giving a kind of an introduction to each one, and a kind of flying commentary on major stuff. And I'm pretty pleased with it. The first one should be out in a few months, I guess.
That's great.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, Dr. Price, it was an honor to have you on, and I ask your forgiveness. Sometimes I get a little tongue-tied around you. I get starstruck when I'm talking to you. I've been listening to you for years, but it's really weird to actually, see you face to face. So even though it's just a video screen. But thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for being on the show.
Fantastic show.
Okay, hopefully you guys enjoyed that interview, like I said, as much as we enjoyed doing it.
Yeah, we're going to have him back.
And we will definitely have him back talking about Lovecraft, or maybe, expanding on this topic too, maybe in the future. Like he was saying, please check out his YouTube channel, The Bible Geek. You can just Google The Bible Geek and find all the stuff. He's written like 1 million books. Some Lovecraft, some biblical stuff, some Jesus mythicist stuff, and it's all really great. So be sure to check that out. And if you like our show, then, please download audio from Project Entertainment Network, watch the YouTube show, Twitter page, Facebook page. We're 13 O'Clock Podcast. You guys know. And also just a reminder, we still have 5 different designs of t-shirts at zazzle.com/13 o'clock. So if you want to go check those out, we'll be putting up some more designs probably eventually. And actually, if you have any suggestions for any designs you'd like based on any of our other topics, then let me know, and I will...
Yeah, just drop it in the comment box.
Yeah, just drop it in the comment box, or wherever you're listening to it, and I will try and accommodate you eventually.
Still like to have real shirt.
I know. I'll get you one. We don't even have any yet.
No, we need anybody.
I know. We need to get some of our own. Okay, so hope you guys enjoyed the show, and remember to tune in next Tuesday. Bye.